Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this poppy card in real time. I got a comment recently saying that most watercolor tutorials are sped up, and so it's really hard to know how quickly you should be doing things, and they feel like they have to really rush because everything they see is really rushed, when in reality it's not, it's just sped up. So let's actually see how I take this card, which by the way I'm using a Strathmore. These are pre-made, pre-scored cards that are just cut to the right size. They're by Strathmore. They're 140-pound cold press paper. You can really use any sort of watercolor paper for this as long as you measure it out and then fold it over. But I like the pre-made ones because they also come with the envelopes and then it makes my life easier. Anyways, we're going to see how I actually paint this card in real time. One of the very first things I do is just tape this down. I just want to make sure it's not going to move around on me, and also it will help to limit the amount of buckling that happens as I add more and more water. It probably won't completely get rid of it, but it will help. This card is going to be done in 2 different layers. We're going to be working on dry paper for each of these layers. And the first thing that we need to do is mix up our first color. And that for me is going to be a nice light poppy reddish color, but there's going to be quite a bit of water in this so that the saturation level is pretty light, because we want this to kind of be like the background petals. We're creating kind of an illusion here. Now I know poppy petals are not really this light, but just for the sake of the painting and making it a little bit easier as well as giving it a little bit of depth, that's how we're going to do it. I'm using my palette here, and my colors have kind of funny names. So I've got marmalade, and then I believe that one is candy apple. One is kind of like a vermilion color, and then one is a more middle red color. And I'm mixing those two together because I want a little bit of that orange undertone that comes with the vermilion. I'm going to keep kind of adjusting by adding more of each color and water until I get to a color that's about like this. Then it's time to grab my card again with that color in one well. I'm taking what I believe is a size 4 quill brush here. It's very similar to something like a size 12 or even bigger round brush. I like the quills because they hold a lot of water. We're painting 3 main poppy flowers here. The first one's going to be the one that's our focal point, and to do that I'm just kind of laying my brush on the side and kind of scribbling up and down in 3 main petals, avoiding that center part. I want to leave a little white space there. Try not to overthink the petal shapes because they don't really matter. We just want 3 of them and then some white space in between. I'm also going to do 2 that are facing to the sides. These are a lot easier. It's essentially just one of those petals with kind of a rounded shape underneath it. I like to scribble my brush up and down to give the top of the petals a little texture. Now, one thing I'm not showing in real time is I did dry this completely, and I didn't record that because I just showed you from face on in a previous video, one of my shorter videos. So in real time, it probably took me about 30 seconds to a minute to dry it. And it's just off to the side now, kind of cooling down while I mix up my second color. This is my second red color. I want this to be way more concentrated. So way less water, way more of those 2 initial colors. Kind of a vermilion type color and kind of a red color mixed together until it's about like this. Now we're repeating the same thing we did previously. We're just going to kind of overlap and go in between those different shapes. I'm kind of scribbling. I'm not really overthinking what my brush is doing here, or even really trying to control it all that much. I'm really just kind of scribbling. I can always go back in and add a little bit more, but I do want to continue to avoid that center space a little bit. I want to make sure that I'm keeping some of the previous layer poking out from behind it because it just gives it that depth. Then almost right away, because this paper was drying pretty quickly, it's going to depend on your paper and how much water you use, but mine was drying pretty quickly. I washed my brush, and then I actually dropped some water directly on those petals because I wanted to create some blooms kind of in the center of them. I'm trying to push the pigment away so that the center of that petal is a little different color than the outsides. I'm going to repeat that same thing on those bottom ones where I'm going to kind of scribble my brush, leaving a little bit of that previous layer poking out from behind. I might even kind of indicate that there are 2 different petals, and then before they dry, I'll wash my brush, put a little water in it, and kind of drop that in the middle of the petal. You could totally leave that here, but one of the other things I'm going to do is while things are still nice and wet, off screen, I'm washing my brush and then I'm picking up more concentrated colors. So instead of going into my mixed colors, I'm actually tapping my brush right into the colors from my pan. So a red, that vermilion, or even sometimes a yellow, and I'm just touching that to the edges of some of the petals just to give it a little extra color variation. Then I'm letting these sit. I do want to do the next part while it's wet, but I don't want it to be too wet. So I'm letting it sit while I mix up my brown color. And in order to do that, I mixed up kind of some leftover brown. And now I'm going to touch that around the center one. Notice that around the edges, I still have quite a bit of water, but towards the center, it was getting a little bit drier. So I'm going to touch that into some of the white areas, so it'll be really concentrated there, but also touch it a little bit into the wet areas, so we will get a little bit of bleeding. I wanted to vary how dark the different parts of that were. So in addition to adding in that brown, I dipped straight into some black and then also tapped around in there. And I did tap in a couple little spots with just a little bit of yellow. Most of that disappeared, but it is there, so maybe it does add a little something. Again, I'm kind of trying to play with how wet things are because I do want when I attach the stems to some of these flowers for it to bleed lightly in, but I don't want it to bleed in too much. So I'm letting those bottom ones where I'm going to attach the stems to them just sit there while I mix up a nice dark green color. And to do that, I combined a little bit of an olive green, a little bit of a yellow, and then also some brown until it was a nice saturation. I made a little cone shape on each of those side-facing poppies, letting it touch and bleed a little bit into the red because it's just a little bit wet there, and then dragging down for a stem. I'm also going to drag down from that center poppy to make the stem. And then poppy leaves are actually kind of a complex shape, or most of them are, and it sounds a little too tedious for me to actually try to paint one exactly, so I am literally just alternating between tapping my brush and then squiggling it a little bit in kind of a leaf shape. The more that you just let this go and don't overthink this part, the more it will actually kind of allude to a poppy leaf. Then for the little poppy pod, I feel like it's never complete without at least one poppy pod because they are stunning. I'm going to make a kind of olive type shape, and I'm using that same green I used for the rest of it, except for I am going to grab a little bit more brown in my brush, mix in with the green, and kind of just add a little bit to the backside so that it bleeds in and gives it some variation. I'll add in the stems so that it makes sense as to where it is in the painting, and I'm also going to wash my brush then, and then just hint to the fact that maybe there are some of those poppy petals just starting to come out of that pod. And then as it sat there, you notice that that center part of the poppy, which is a typically really dark part of the flower, has lightened and bled a bunch. So now that it's kind of soaked in a bit more, I am going to bring in some more concentrated colors and tap that around the center. Finally calling it good and then giving it a nice dry. And then these cards are really wonderful because since they're pre-scored, they're real easy. You can just fold them over and they cleanly crease, and then you can give it as a card. Anyways, I hope it was really helpful to see this in real time. That was a lot of talking and I was able to actually explain it a little bit better, I think, as well. My goal is always to make sure that you guys get to see what I do and kind of use things as inspiration. I definitely think there is value in a longer format, really explained real-time video like this, but I also love the idea of the shorter ones because sometimes when you are over-explain something, you're trying to redo what I do exactly, and since you hear and see exactly what I'm doing, then you have a lot of disappointment when it isn't exactly mine. Whereas if you have the general premise and just some of the general ideas around it, you can kind of take your own spin on it, and you don't have an expectation for it to look exactly like mine. It's more like, hey, did I paint poppies in a way that I like? And I love that. So hopefully by me having this in a shorter version as well as this longer version, it's helpful in both ways. I hope you have a wonderful day.